Hey Bookends! Welcome to a 10-minute book review. I'm 10. Today's book review is going to be on Bloodchild by Octavia Butler. So this is not new. As you can see, this is an older copy of mine. Yeah, my books are dog-eared. Not because I don't like them, but because if I like a book a lot, things start to happen to it because I take it everywhere. But yes, the reason we're doing Octavia Butler book this week is because it is Octavia Butler week. Someone said Octavia Butler day, but no, my girl gets a whole week. So we like to start off every book review with a star point, as in out of 10 stars, how many stars did this particular book garner, and a rating, as in if this was a movie, what would it be rated? Star point, this is a solid 7. Because it is multiple short stories and essays by her, if I could grade all the essays, I would say they're all 10s. Not all the stories were ones that I particularly cared for, but I was still happy to have a piece of her, you know, to read. And for the rating of, you know, PG-13, there isn't really anything that rises above the PG-13. In fact, most stays around the PG level, especially with the descriptions. And when sex is had, is more so mentioned, but it's not expounded upon. So there are no love scenes. There are just sentences that let you know that someone is becoming intimate with someone else, and the next sentence will say that that whole experience ended. So I'm not going to go into every single story. What I will do is give a brief synopsis of them and let you know what my favorites are. And if you're wondering why I'm looking down, because I'm making a mask. You may not be able to see it because of the flower pattern behind me, but it's like a farm. So yes, I'm making a mask for my nephew because I love him. Okay, so the first story in the book is the title story, Bloodchild. So this story follows a group of humans who have fled their home world, I'm assuming Earth, due to mistreatment. And they are on this other planet with these worm-like creatures, and these are huge worms. But they are also sentient worms. And they need a body to put their offspring in, their larvae in order for them to survive. And we follow the story of one young man who has been promised by his family to a family friend who happens to be one of these aliens. The interesting thing about this is it goes into the idea of male childbirth, because he has this fear of this creature that's growing inside of him ripping its way through his body, or out of his body. And, you know, reading it sounds like such a horrible thing. But as a mother who has gone through having a little entity feeding off of me for 9 whole months, off of everything that I ate, having to live for 2 people, and then having the prospect of this little person busting out of me without any form of medical assistance, it's not such a far-fetched idea, I'll say. It's something that mothers have been dealing with since babies have been getting born. But hearing it from the perspective, and it's not anything odd or new. It can be something that one might think to be traumatizing, of course. But the idea of it itself isn't odd or new. What's odd and new is the perspective. Because we always just assume this is just a part of being a parent. This is a part of being a mom. You get pregnant. You have this adorable little entity eating off of you, feeding off of you. You're living for them. You can't drink, you know, liquor or anything while they're inside of you because you want the best for them. And then at some point, they're ready to burst out of you. Because that's what they do. They push them little selves out of you. That's what they do. Your body pushes them. They push themselves. It hurts really bad. Really bad. And yeah, they kind of claw their little lovely selves out of you, and then you love them forever. But this boy has been raised with the idea that this is going to be his life, and he doesn't have a problem with it because he feels as though, you know, he knows the entity that wants to do this to him, and she's been a close family friend for years. And fun fact, she was actually born from his father. They usually take the men to do this because they say the women are needed to, you know, the female women, the female humans, I should say, are needed to create more humans. So they're needed. There's some interesting world building in this too. So one interesting thing is not every one of the aliens are able to give birth to children. I believe in most litters there's only one boy, and in most litters I believe there's only 1 to 2 girls who are fertile. So let's just say if someone has a litter of 7 larvae that burst through, or that are cut out I should say, only 1 or 2 of those larvae will be able to reproduce, and only 1 of them will be a boy. So, and it's supposed to be like an honor kind of a thing to be chosen to do this. Something happens in the book where he sees a man basically going into labor without the help of his alien companion, I guess. And that throws the boy for a loop because he sees someone giving birth. And, you know, with no kind of sedative or anything. If it's your alien and they're able to give you a sedative made from them because they're used to your biology, if it's another alien, they can't do that. They can't provide you with a sedative. Now, when I first read this story, it was years ago. I was not married, I don't believe, and I also did not have a child. Reading this story again after having a child, it really resonates with me because when I went into the hospital to have my son, there was a woman down the hall from me screaming like her arm was being ripped out of the socket. Like she was just, it was like a horror movie. Like she was just, oh my god, it was just thinking about it gives me chills. But that scared me, and I was going through labor myself. I was going through the pains of labor, but managing it. But hearing that scared me so bad. And the nurse who was there, she come for me and she's like, "It's okay, honey, you're not gonna go through that." She wanted to give birth, what did she say, naturally? Yeah, naturally. She wanted to give, so natural is different from vaginal. You know, if you're having a baby vaginally, most women have their baby vaginally, push the baby out. Naturally means no medication. No epidural, no pain meds, no sedatives, nothing. Straight nature doing its course. So she was having a baby naturally. She's like, don't worry about that because that's not going to be how things are going to work for you because, you know, you're not having a baby naturally. You're taking the meds. Which, you know, I agreed to. I wanted an epidural and anything that they could do to make the process not so painful. But this boy watching a man go through this because the larvae were literally about eating through him. And that was a painful experience, of course. And that made him have second thoughts about something that he was raised all of his life to feel as though it was a great honor. If I had been in a position before I had my son where I saw a woman giving birth naturally, or heard a woman giving birth naturally, not how the actors do it in the hospitals and the actresses, you know, do stuff in the hall. If I had actually seen it for real, or heard it for real, then I would probably not have had my son. I probably would have been traumatized. I would not be a mom right now because I'd be too traumatized. I don't know how I would have gotten over that. Thankfully, that was not the case. But there is an interesting conflict put into the book because of that. Is the next generation worth the pain that they would cause to be born to this generation? Is it worth me going through pain to ensure, or even trauma or possibly death, because a man could have died? Is it worth me going through pain, trauma, and death, possible death, to ensure the safety of the next generation, or ensure the viability of the next generation? And that is a really, really personal answer, and you'll get a lot of different answers from different people. Some people will be like, you know, we have enough people on earth, we don't need any more. And other people will be like, children are a blessing, they're, you know, blessing from God, they are supposed to be here. My feeling, I wanted my baby very much, but had I been in a position where I had seen or heard what happens in childbirth, once again, not a mock of it, not like a TV show, but actually seen or heard what happens in birth, I probably would not have made the decision to have a child. So I'm happy that I wasn't exposed to that. And at the end of it, the alien actually was saying, you know, humans shouldn't be exposed to seeing what happens during birth, you know, because it's a very private thing and it's scary. And the boy is like, no, we need to see this. We need to know what's going on. We need to see what happens when it's a good thing, when it's a good birth, when, you know, everything happens the way it should happen. It was a very interesting dynamic in the whole world building, and how originally people would have wanted, like aliens would have wanted to try to kidnap the humans, and the humans had guns and they were ready to kill the aliens, but they were trying to make a tentative peace. And it was a really interesting world building for a story that only lasted maybe 15 pages. So she created a whole world with its own conflict in 15 pages. And the ending seemed fitting. It didn't feel like, you know, sometimes short stories can feel incomplete. Like you're wondering, okay, what happened next? I know it's a short story, but it ended too short. Well, this was different. It seemed to end at the right spot, because I never went into the story feeling as though I was going to follow this character forever. But I did go into the story feeling as though there was some sort of arc that was going to complete. And that arc did complete, so that was a really good one. The next story is The Evening and the Morning and the Night. So this one, let me just make sure. I believe this is the one about mental illness, but let me just make sure. Yes, this is the one about physical and mental illness. So in this story, it follows a young woman whose parents have this mental disorder, which can cause them to self-harm. It makes them literally feel as though they are trapped inside their body, like claustrophobic in their own skin. And eventually people who have it end up dying. They end up killing themselves because they end up tearing their flesh and breaking their bones and stuff like that, so they can try to, you know, get out of their own flesh. They decided to marry each other, and since it is a genetic disorder, their daughter ended up with the same thing. Now, there are ways to manage it. There's a special diet, these biscuits that they have to eat every day, that helps to manage the symptoms of the disease. And it starts off with the young woman that we're following. She says that she decided not to have her biscuits for a week because she wanted to show her independence. Like, I could do what I want, whenever I want, however I want. Her mother decided to take her to the ward where, or parents decided to take her to the ward where people like them are held once they start going. And that scared her straight, because she saw people with fingers missing, eyes gouged out, skin ripped off their arms. And this is some things that they did to themselves. No one tortured them or anything. These are things that they willfully did to themselves in an attempt to get out of their own bodies. Even though there's nothing wrong with their bodies. It's a mental thing. So she ends up going off to college. We follow her to college, and while she's in college, unfortunately, while she's away, I should say, not in college, but while she's away from her parents, her father ends up murdering her mother. This is not a spoiler, because it doesn't really do anything for the story one way or the other. But it does show you why she's on her own, like why she doesn't have a security net or anyone to fall back on. Her father ends up murdering her mother, and one poignant thing, you know, and then kills himself. One poignant thing that she was saying was that, you know, the police told her that her mother had been skinned alive. Not alive, had been skinned. Her skin had been ripped off her body, and that she personally hoped that her mother had been dead before her father did that. So this was a very interesting read, and I thought Octavia really brought to the fore autonomy and free will for people who have either mental or emotional or physical disabilities, because it's very easy to say, well, this person's schizophrenic, they don't deserve to have children. This person is autistic, they can't take care of children. This person only has one leg, how are they going to get around with children? And it steals autonomy from a person who should have the right to make the decision as to whether or not they would like to have children. My mindset is, if this person can live independent of help from others, strong independence. So I don't mean like they have a spouse that helps them get around. Like, no, your spouse is supposed to help you. If this person is at a level mentally where they are not in need of assistance to make day-to-day decisions, they should be allowed to be able to have children. I know in the United States there was a time, maybe in the 50s I believe, where they were sterilizing people with Down syndrome, people who had autism, even though they didn't call it autism, people who they believed to be mentally retarded. They would sterilize them. They wouldn't give them the option of, hey, you know, I don't want to be sterile, or yeah, sure, I never want to have kids. They were forcefully sterilizing them. And this book shows both sides of the coin. Her parents raised her the best that they could. They gave her a stable home, a loving and stable home. Eventually they end up succumbing to the disease, or I should say her father ends up succumbing to it and murdering her mother and himself. But that doesn't mean that naysayers who would say these people should not be allowed to have children, it doesn't mean that they were right, because she's living a full and happy life. They lived a full and happy life until, unfortunately, what happened. So it's an interesting conversation about autonomy and people who are considered in some way disabled. Okay, for the next book, or I should say next story. The next story is Next of Kin, or Near of Kin. So that one was really interesting as well. So I'm just going to put it out there. It's a story about incest. A young woman, we follow a young woman whose mother just died. Now, the young woman herself was raised by her grandmother. She considered her mother to be uncaring, aloof, didn't want her, didn't love her. She's very close to her grandmother, who's her mother's mother, and her uncle, her mother's brother. And over the years, she finds certain similarities between herself and her uncle. And her uncle ends up admitting to her that, yes, I'm your dad. Your mother couldn't, you know, tell anyone, I couldn't tell anyone, and if we had lived in different times, I would have married her. So that's really the gist of that story. What I found interesting about that story was that Octavia said that her inspiration for it was the Bible, how Abraham married his sister, and how Isaac married his cousin, and you know, how the children of Adam and Eve married each other, and how the idea of marrying a sibling at that time, or even a cousin at that time, was not considered in any way taboo. I would say most people weren't marrying their sisters and brothers, I would say. I don't believe pickings were that slim, aside from with Adam's children, but there was a lot of cousin-to-cousin marriage. And she said she wanted to make a modern story that kind of sympathized with that mindset. Now, of course, genetically speaking, it is not a good thing for a brother and sister to have a child or have sex or anything. Just genetically speaking, it's wrong. Emotionally speaking, if someone's raised as a family member, I don't know how they could turn off "this is my family" and turn on "this is someone I'm sexually attracted to." I don't know how they can do that. I'm sure some people could. But yeah, she wrote a story in which she wanted you to be sympathetic towards that type of relationship. Now, here's the thing. The story does not go into that relationship. It's almost like her brother and her okay, so the girl's mother and her uncle kind of had a one-night stand, but her uncle had feelings for her mother for a long time, and so did her mother for him. But that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is the aftermath. The girl was saying, like, if you had just told me, if she had just told me, I would have been okay with it. And the guy was like, you know, I said that many times too. But she was afraid of how you would react. She was afraid of how people would react to the idea of it. You know, she didn't want her mother, the grandmother, to know either. So it was interesting. I won't say that made me sympathize, but it was interesting seeing another angle in regards to it, because when we see it in the Bible, it's not so off-putting because we expect it. You know, there weren't that many people there, so if pickings are slim, you gotta pick from what's there. But in this day and age, there are legit so many different people, you don't have to pick the person in the room next door. So yeah, that was Near of Kin. Next one is Speech Sounds. This one is really interesting. It's not one of my favorites, but it is interesting. This is a story of basically of America. It might be the whole world, but there was some sort of a virus, cue Corona, but there was some kind of a virus that killed people, and the ones that did not kill left them either unable to speak, unable to understand speech, unable to hear, or unable to read. So it affected their cognitive abilities to be able to understand each other, almost like Babel hit again. And there's this woman who she lost her sons, or her kids, and her husband to the virus. And she's traveling around trying to, you know, get to where her brother lives, to go live with her brother and his family. She ends up coming across 2 children who were born, little kids, who are able to read and talk and hear. So that was interesting. It kind of sets up, like, if in a world where everyone's jealous of everyone else, who shows compassion, who shows love, who's the first one to take the first step to say, okay, I understand I can't do as much as you can, but I'm still going to care for you anyway. Not one of my favorite stories, but it was an interesting one. The next one is Crossover. She has a bit of an alcohol problem, and everywhere she goes there's this guy with a scar on his face, and that follows her. And I believe he's a lover, ex-lover, boyfriend, ex-boyfriend, and he follows her home. They end up having sex, and she has these really bad headaches. Whenever he's around, she has these really bad headaches. As it turns out, she is schizophrenic and off her medication because she feels as though she doesn't really need to be on it. And every time she comes off of her medication, this is the hallucination that she has, this person. And this story, although it's more of a day in the life of, because it's supposed to be set in modern times, just like the other one. So although it's more of a day in the life of, it is a commentary, I personally feel, a commentary on what someone is allowed to feel is real and what they're allowed to not feel is real. So to give an example of that, or even just to give an example in the book of that, she is having this affair sort of with this man who doesn't really exist. And who is that hurting? Aside from her, possibly. But who is that hurting? She's not violent. She's not going around trying to kill people like how they normally portray people who are schizophrenic in the movies and in thrillers and stuff like that. She's not trying to go around hurting anyone. She's not trying to go around doing anything harmful. She goes to work. She pays her rent. She pays her bills. She has these hallucinations. She has sex with this hallucination. She has a whole relationship with this hallucination. Aside from herself, who is she hurting? And with that question being asked, should she be allowed to be able to continue this relationship with this fictitious person, you know, despite it not being perhaps healthy for her? And who has the right to decide if something's not healthy for an adult? Who has the right to take that person's autonomy away from them and say, this is not healthy for you, even though technically it's not physically hurting you, and it's not technically physically hurting anyone else? You don't have the right to do this? Who has the right to take that autonomy away from an adult? And it is an interesting question, because on one side, this person is not real. So no matter what relationship she's forging with them, they do not exist. It's not as though she has dissociative identity disorder, where she has separate people living within her brain and each person has their own identity. This is nothing like that. This is a bona fide hallucination who she sees in front of her, not shares space in her brain, but who is independent of her, independent of her body, independent of her psyches. This is something that she sees outside of her and is fully aware of. Because you find out later that she's kind of aware of why he's there, why he shows up. And she tries to self-medicate with liquor. But ultimately, she doesn't want to be alone, and he keeps her from being alone. So that is an interesting question. So there are two stories in this book that question about, or I should say, question the autonomy of someone who is considered disabled. One question is whether that disabled person should be allowed to be able to create a family, even though there's a possibility that the little person that they may be creating will suffer just as much as they do. And also, does the person who is disabled have the autonomy to be able to decide whether or not they should be medicated, and how it is they should be allowed to live their life off of their medication if they're not a danger to themselves or others while doing so. So two interesting commentaries, one book, and both about mental illness. Okay, or should I say mental illness and disability. I'm going to skip her essays because they're really just her personal musings, so I can't really grade, talk about someone's personal musings. Now, this book came out in two parts. The original book I have on my Kindle, and that was updated, and then I got this. So the original book doesn't have these two final stories in it, which are Amnesty and the Book of Martha. Okay, so Amnesty is another book about humans and aliens, except this time we didn't go to another planet. The aliens came to us, and they wanted things we were not prepared nor willing to give them, and eventually there was sort of a tentative peace, simply because the humans weren't willing to give up their freedoms entirely, and the aliens had the choice either killing us all off or making some kind of tentative peace. I'm making some headway with the mask, by the way, if you can see, kind of. So, yeah. So the young lady that we follow in this book, she is kind of an interpreter, kind of an ambassador for hire for these people. She was taken when she was a child by the aliens because they took a lot of different people, and she was basically raised with them. And when she was released, she decided to go back and work with them for money. And the ones that she works for, she's very pleased with. The one they want her to work with, not so much, but she's going to take on the job. Now, the interesting thing about this entity is that it individually has autonomy, but also it has bushels of itself that they kind of lump together, and that one lump becomes autonomous as well. So it's kind of like having all these people live in an apartment, and each person is their own person, but then at some point they all lump together to become one person to make decisions and stuff. I'm perhaps not giving the best description, but I can say that in the book she says that they kind of look like hedges, that the aliens kind of look like hedges, little very large hedges. Not much happens in the book aside from her trying to convince more of her own people that, we have to work with them or they'll kill us, which is the truth. And she's like, they'll pay us, we should probably just try to live. What I found interesting, once again, is the visualization and the world building. As someone who's asexual and doesn't really get much out of the idea of sex and sexual things, I love how Octavia Butler describes how physicality can be pleasurable in a way that is not sexual. So she brings out that the young woman while you're being held by, or while she's being held by these aliens, they enjoy holding the humans because they're much bigger than us, and once again, they're bushels. So they enjoy holding us. And she says that the feeling of being held by them is enjoyable as well. And so it's nice to, the descriptions given are very descriptive. They help you to understand why it feels nice for her. And the niceness of it isn't a sexual thing. Even though they prefer to hold her when she's naked, and that she prefers that as well, that it has nothing to do with sexuality. It has more to do with physical contact. And they can make contact with more of her while she's naked as opposed to while she has clothes on. So, once again, that wasn't one of my favorite stories, but it was an interesting story, or at least the descriptions and depictions made within it. The final story is the Book of Martha, and gotta be honest, didn't like that book. Didn't like that short story. I can see why I was left out of the first one. I can see why Amnesty was left out of the first one as well, because even though it's not a bad story, it is a repetitive story. So it's something that we have seen before from Octavia, especially in the Lilith trilogy, where there's this one human that has to act as an ambassador for the aliens. So we did see that with Lilith. Well, I call it Lilith trilogy, but it's actually Lilith's Brood. That's what it is. It's about 4 books. So we did see that troop from Octavia originally, or already I should say, so it's more of the same, nothing new. So I can see why these 2 stories are left out, but also I'm happy to have the continuation. So yeah, once again, this has been a book review for Bloodchild by Octavia Butler. And if you like what you see, please like and subscribe. Bye, Bookends.